Welcome to a fresh take on the news, putting you at the centre of the national conversation about the issues that matter to you most. Tonight, with Russia on the warpath, leaders around the world attempt to figure out what, if anything, will stop Mr. Putin. I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Each week, we get to the heart of the issue dominating the headlines. Tonight, as Ukraine comes under fire, our viewers panel from across the country will share their stories. They'll have their say, and they'll hold our studio guests to account. Joining us this week, General Sir Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Dr. Kojo Koram, author of Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. The columnist, broadcaster and former Labour Special Advisor, Aisha Hazarika. And Sir Simon Fraser, policy analyst and former permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office. The question facing us all tonight: is Britain still a global power?
Breaking news this morning is that it is war. President Putin's military operation in Ukraine is now well underway.
Whoever tries to hinder us should know that Russia's response will be immediate.
Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor.
President Putin of Russia has unleashed war in our European continent.
Nuclear forces on high alert.
We must help. That's what we've always done as a country.
I don't believe that the Russian dictator will ever subdue the national feeling of the Ukrainians.
The air raid sirens are irregular now. It's scary stuff.
Someone praying for peace for this country.
Let's start, as always, with our viewers panel. I want to talk to Lydia, a Ukrainian viewer in the UK. Lydia, talk to us about your family's experience.
My sister, had to flee Kyiv with her husband and son on Wednesday around 5 o'clock in the morning. They left just the buildings, the apartments, and drop in the car without any needed stuff. And they set off to west of Ukraine, where my parents live. But they know nowhere to hide from bombing, because my parents live from Ivano-Frankivsk in few miles, and the airport has been bombed twice, and they had been sheltering in basement. And all people, kids, in tents, anxiety. We are in grief, in sorrow, all around Ukrainians in sorrow. We can't sleep, we can't think. We want stop this war and ask you, I am appealing now to leaders of USA, UK, European Union to help us, because I think this is not Ukrainians' problem, this is human problems, because Putin is hungry, greedy president. I can't even call him leader because he is evil, devil. We need to stop this because to prevent an even bigger war.
Lydia, I think everybody here hears you, and I should tell you they can hear you there in Ukraine too. Maybe move and talk to another person, Ukrainian background, Marina Ivanyuk. Marina.
Hi, I can't say good evening because it's not good for me. I have been protesting every single day outside of Downing Street, where I lost my voice, so I try to speak as loud as I can. I have written the letter to the Queen with hope that she will, and the country, the United Kingdom, will take the strong action against Russia. Ukrainian military is strong and brave, but we need help from West. We need to stop bombs falling on our heads, on heads of the children. They're killing our husbands, sons, women, and child. Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and agreed to give up our nuclear weapon in exchange that the United Kingdom and the West will guarantee the protection and sovereignty to our country. First, I want to say thanks to the United Kingdom, to the Boris Johnson, to Priti Patel, who allowed our asylum seeker to come to the country. But I want to ask the panel, why is the United Kingdom is not taking real action to stop the war, to stop Putin invasion? Because when the Ukraine will fall, the Europe will be next, the United Kingdom will be next. Yeah, thank you.
Marina, thank you so much. That was a very clear question from Marina. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, why is the UK remaining calm and not taking real action? Richard Sheriff, what is the answer to that?
Well, firstly, thank you to Lydia and Marina. And what you say is heartrending beyond belief. And I think we all understand or try to understand the grief and the pain that you and your countrymen and women are going through. This is like a nightmare which we're living through. To the question why, what is the United Kingdom doing and why can't it do more? I think it would be fair to say that the United Kingdom has not been sitting on its hands. Clearly, I can completely understand why you feel that it is not enough. But for some 20 years, the United Kingdom has been training and supporting and equipping the Ukrainian armed forces. The United Kingdom has sent, I think, quite a significant amount of arms and ammunition and equipment to Ukraine in recent weeks. And the United Kingdom, I'm sure, will do what it can to support indirectly. But then you come to the real question, why cannot it support Ukraine directly? I guess what you're really saying is, why is the United Kingdom not putting soldiers on the ground in Ukraine?
Richard Sheriff, I want to come to that in a moment, but could we do more? Simon Fraser, you, when you were at Foreign Office, probably would have been in all of those meetings, the Cobra meetings and all the rest of it, deciding, what do we do? What would you be advising?
Yeah, well,
how would you answer that?
I would have been in those meetings, and how I answer that is to say, look, it goes partly to the whole question that we're discussing, is the UK still a global power? We have power, but we don't have the capacity on our own as a country, I think, to take on Russia militarily or to put troops, for example, on the ground in Ukraine. And so we have to work with other countries. And I would certainly have been saying we need the strongest possible alignment with America, with other Western democracies, the European Union and NATO allies, to take action. And although we don't actually have a commitment to Ukraine as a NATO ally, and that is something we could debate as to whether we should actually have that commitment, but what we have seen is a pretty robust reaction by those democracies in a united way, which has certainly taken Putin by surprise. Now, it doesn't solve the problem for those people who are suffering on the ground in Ukraine at the moment, but I think at least we could say that the reaction has been, in many ways, stronger than I expected, and that is at least a relatively good point, I think, for us to take recognition of.
All right, let's come, in a way, to the point that Richard Sheriff started to address. I'm going to talk to Steve Diasher in Manchester, who I think has a point for our panel. Steve.
Yeah, firstly, I think all our thoughts are with Lydia and with all the people of Ukraine and Ukraine itself, and that we do stand firmly behind you. Being next to man myself, this makes my blood boil just knowing how yet again we throw sanctions at Putin and he just laughs at us in our faces because it's just words, 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 and he laughs. And it means nothing to him. We cut off his assets. We cut off the SWIFT banking systems, which Putin doesn't care about, because all we know he's using the cryptocurrency. That is one of those things. What is a possibility? What's not being thought about yet? We want to put boots on the ground. We want to send people into Ukraine, but until Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, as a country, as a nation, there's not a lot we cannot do. And it's horrible, because believe you me, I would put on my boots tomorrow as soon as Ukraine became a member of NATO, and I will be standing side by side on the ground, helping Ukraine and its people claim back their country. So we need to let Ukraine become a member of NATO as soon as possible.
Thank you, Steve. Marina, how do you respond to what Steve Dash has just said about putting boots on the ground in Ukraine?
We need the help of every single person. So if someone can come and help us, we're just waiting for that help. So everyone who can come, please come and support us in every step, humanitarian help. If you can come and physically protect us, come and protect us, please.
Thank you, Marina. Aisha Hazarika, is that part of the answer here?
Well, I think a lot of people will have found it quite extraordinary that our Foreign Secretary indicated that she would support British citizens that wanted to take up that call to arms that President Zelensky setting up this international legion. She said she would support people, yet we will not put British boots on the ground. Now, we all understand the reasons that Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and we're very mindful that, for NATO equipment and NATO soldiers, etc., to start attacking Russia, that takes it into another dimension. However, if President Putin, and let's be honest, he has underperformed so far, he's been humiliated by the Ukrainians' resistance and their spirit and their defiance. If he moves into using chemical weapons or using weapons of mass destruction, NATO has got to revisit the question. There may be the rules about NATO, but there's a moral question that NATO and the West will have to answer.
Richard Sheriff?
I think we need to be clear. If Britain and other NATO countries got involved directly in fighting in Ukraine, that is the start of the Third World War. No question about it. And similarly, if any attempt to impose a no-fly zone would guarantee the start of the Third World War. It is a brutal fact of life that Ukraine is not a member of NATO and therefore is not covered by the guarantee of collective defence that says an attack on one is an attack on all. So the very best that NATO can do now is to stop this any form of expansion of the war by defending NATO territory, demonstrating that it is prepared to fight to the teeth to protect NATO territory, but also to continue to support Ukraine indirectly with weapons, with equipment, potentially other capabilities as well, and also to start helping the Ukrainians prepare to fight underground if it comes to that.
Koja Koram, is that enough?
Well, I think first of all, thank you to Marina and Lydia for their heart-wrenching testimony, and full solidarity goes to the Ukrainian people for the horrors that we've witnessed them go through over the past week. But I think that the question of what that solidarity looks like relies on our idea of what is the most useful thing Britain can do to help the people of Ukraine. What's the most useful thing that Britain can do to weaken Vladimir Putin? And the horrors that we've seen in the Ukraine over the past week have prompted a long overdue conversation in the UK about why the kleptocrats that have propped up Putin's regime have used London as their base of operations.
But if we're dealing with the military question here, should we be in a position to put our soldiers into that theatre?
I think a unilateral entrance into war with Putin is not something that would be an option. We need to think about how humanitarian intervention has worked in the past, and we need to think, is there non-military tactics that could actually be more harmful to Putin than boots on the ground. And I think that that financial weakening of him is part of that.
All right. Let me go back to our viewers panel, and I'd like to talk to Emmanuel Ojingwa. Emmanuel, what is your view about what we could do?
Good evening, Trevor. I think that we knew that this was going to happen. We had the intel. We knew months ago that the war was going to happen, so it didn't take us by surprise. What is unfolding at the moment is not a surprise to us. We knew that we needed to hit Putin with sanctions, enough sanctions to make things more difficult for him. So my question to the panel is, have we really done enough? Why didn't we use the sanctions that are on at the moment to hit him hard enough to make sure that we could have prevented what was going on now?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Simon Fraser, Mr. Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. He's never made much secret of his view that he wanted to reconstruct either the Russian or the Soviet Empire, whatever he wants to call it. We could have seen this coming.
Well, we could have seen it coming, I suppose, and we could have taken it more seriously. And I think I wouldn't defend the fact that, you know, with hindsight, maybe we certainly misread him. I mean, it's a very good question that's been raised as to whether we could have done more sooner to deter this action. It's not true that we knew this was going to happen months ago. I mean, there were indications it might happen. I think that we didn't know it was going to happen until relatively recently. Again, maybe that was a misreading of Putin. And, you know, one of the great things in diplomacy and international relations is you really have to understand where your adversary is coming from. Sometimes you make the mistake of thinking that everybody thinks the same. They think about the world in the way that we think about it, and that can be a mistake. So we could perhaps have done more to deter this, impose the sanctions earlier. We were late to do what we've done. I accept that charge, actually. But on the other hand, we have moved very fast when we've woken up. We may have woken up too late, but we have woken up. And if you look at what, for example, the European Union and Germany and others have now done, it's pretty remarkable. Too late may be, but let's hope that it's not too late to actually influence Putin in the long run and damage him in the way that's been described so that we can deter him from further violent action.
OK, well, you mentioned the other European powers. So coming up, our viewers and studio panellists will be discussing if there are any leaders strong enough to stand up to Russia.
The European Union will finance the purchase and delivery of weapons.
We will invest more than 2% of our GDP in defence every year from now on.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Leaders of the free world, if you won't help us today, tomorrow war will be knocking on your door.
Is Britain still a global power? And it's not just the UK which has responded to the attack on Ukraine. Countries around the world have condemned President Putin's actions and imposed retaliatory measures in response. But is the Russian leader taking any notice? Let's start things off with a question from our viewers panel, and I want to talk to Joni Cunningham. Joni, you're in Bristol. Please talk to us.
Hi there. I've got a quick question. Is President Putin taking advantage of a lack of leadership in European countries? There seems to be a vacuum of power. I'm wondering whether we've perhaps kind of sleepwalking into this a little bit.
And your view about this is... What's your own answer to your question?
Yeah, I do think there's been a vacuum of leadership. I feel like, maybe not current leaders, but previous leaders, I think we've been sleepwalking a little bit. I think it's been on the agenda. I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts are on that.
Thank you very much, Joni. Well, look, Joni's question is this. Is President Putin taking advantage of a lack of leadership in European countries? Simon Fraser.
Well, I think one of the reasons why he chose to act now is because it was opportunistic. He thought that this was a moment of maximum weakness in the West. The Americans are weakened after Afghanistan and they're very divided at home. Britain, I mean, we have domestic political problems here. And, of course, after Brexit...
Can't imagine what you're talking about.
And after Brexit as well, I think our position is unclear on a number of these things. And in Europe, We've had a change of government and coalition in Germany. President Macron is up for re-election. So for a number of reasons, there's been a lot going on. And yes, I think it's fair to say there was unclarity and a lack of focus and a lack of leadership. But I'll make the point again that once he's taken this action, I've been positively surprised by the way that the European countries, both at national level and collectively through the EU and in NATO, have actually responded. And indeed, the European Commission, a much maligned organisation in this country, under the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has actually made some really dramatic moves in terms of announcing sanctions and extending, for example, the funding of military equipment to Ukraine in quite a significant way. So there has been a lack of leadership, but it seems to have come together recently.
Koja Koram.
So I think the points that Simon makes are really insightful, and we need to recognise that this points to the kind of illogic of Putin's plan, even on its own basis, that it resulted in a unification of NATO and a unification of the West in a way that hadn't happened for a generation. I think that the economic sanctions are welcome, but I think they can go much further. I think that we need to remember that Russia holds about half of its wealth offshore. It's an incredible level of financial exposure for a great power, one that might be unprecedented in history. And this could be an opportunity to really weaken the financial support that keeps Putin in power. And I think that that's the next step that needs to be pushed for.
All right, we'll come back to that. Let's go back to the war. Let's go to the viewers panel. Natasha Dillon. Do you think that we have the leadership that can really challenge Putin?
Well,
he's a tough guy.
Sorry, Putin is a playground bully. He's consumed by his lust for power and his desire to leave the legacy of reuniting the USSR. His words and actions have become increasingly deranged, and the West has been following its usual bureaucratic procedures in an orderly fashion. We're facing an unhinged despot with his finger on the button, and we cannot wait for sanctions to take effect. We're at a critical point in our history, and if we're too slow to act decisively, this war will have far-reaching consequences for the entire world. I think that the only leadership currently that could stand up to Putin is NATO. And I don't see why we can't allow allow Ukraine some emergency membership to NATO, because if we don't stand up to Putin now, he will not stop at Ukraine.
Thank you, Natasha. Richard Shearis, this would have fallen into your lap as the Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO.
I mean, to the question of, is there the leadership to stand up to this man? Well, the old line, cometh the hour, cometh the man or woman, and we must hope that cometh the man or woman. I can tell you somewhere that cometh the man is evident, and that is in Ukraine with President Zelensky. He has really stepped up to the mark, and I think we have to admire his courage and his charisma. I think it's too early, frankly. To the previous question from the lady from Bristol about has lack of leadership, in a sense, led to where we are now, the answer is categorically yes in the West, I'm afraid. So now it's up to, this is a come-as-you-are party. We've got to do this with the leaders we've got. So we've got to hope they step up to the mark.
You're talking Johnson, Macron, Draghi, now Scholz. You're saying these guys don't have what it takes?
I'm saying we better hope they do. The jury is out. But to the point about NATO, we need to be clear about this. If NATO is to get involved on the ground in Ukraine, NATO is going to have to fight the Third World War from a standing start. What have we seen thus far? NATO has started the process of reinforcing the eastern flank with the NATO response force. It's a start, but that does not yet constitute a genuine warfighting capability, and it will take some time to generate that. Because the reality is, I'm afraid, that we have seen a decade and a half, if not longer, of cumulative disarmament in Europe, of depending on America to underpin European defence. And now, I'm afraid, the chickens are coming home to roost. Okay. So what? It's not too late. We can do something about it, but I'll let you ask somebody else another question.
Aisha Hazarika, you said a moment ago we should put boots on the ground. General Richards saying that's World War III right there.
I'm not advocating that now. I'm saying if there are practices of genocide or weapons of mass destruction or chemical weapons being used. But to the question, I think we have to be honest that leaders in Europe were completely unprepared for this on a political level, on an economic level, on a military level, on an emotional level, and a cultural level and psychological level. I think we have all been very, very naive about President Putin, and all the signs have been there. And that's because a lot of countries have been too inward-looking. You know, we in Britain have had this huge drama happening over Brexit and internal things. And what is it that we have learned from this episode? There is strength in unity. And I really hope that European leaders step up. And I think we're seeing that. But there is one other leader who could be germane in this, and that is President Xi of China. Because if we are closing off Western markets and reliance to Russia, then China is the next go-to. We know that Xi and Putin have a close relationship. China abstained at a big Security Council vote. President Xi could be key in what happens next.
Big point, and I definitely want to come back to that a little later. But let's just stick with the European territory for a moment. And I want to talk to Malcolm Severin.
I suppose my question is, would Putin have risked this if Trump was still president? He and other would-be despots knew that Trump himself was mad enough to launch his missile rather than just words. What will we face next? China invading Taiwan, North Korea invading South Korea. The point has been made, and I totally agree, we've allowed the West to be seen as very weak, and despots do not respond, well, they do respond to weakness with aggressive action.
Well, there's I can see a couple of thumbs up to that. Simon Fraser, what's your view about that?
Well, if we've been better off with Trump?
Correct.
Well, I mean, interestingly enough, of course, Trump came out and said that that Putin's move had been very savvy, taking over some nice territory in Ukraine. So I don't think we can take Trump too seriously. I mean, actually, Trump is largely responsible for the disunity of the West, which we've been talking about. He undermined NATO. He was aggressive and hostile towards NATO partners. He created a lot of uncertainty in the West. So I don't think he's the answer. I do agree, however, with what has been said, that what we really need is unity amongst the Western powers and Western countries, using the institutions we have, the European Union, NATO and others. And we're supposed to be talking about the UK, so let's just make the point. I don't think the UK's record over the last few years in terms of being active in promoting unity in Europe is a very impressive one. And I hope we will learn a lesson from this, that we need to work with other democracies in Europe and not antagonise them.
All right, thank you very much. Is Britain still a global power? Before we come back to our viewers panel, we're joined from Kyiv by Ivana Klympush-Tynsadze, former Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine and current chair of the Parliamentary Committee on the Integration of Ukraine to the EU. Good evening, Ivana.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. If it's any good, because it's not good here in Ukraine.
Well, I was going to ask you to just start by telling us what is the mood tonight in Kyiv? What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
The mood is pretty tough because we've had some very serious rockets being just sent over the city, and we had several major blasts around the city. And also what we are seeing right now is that you were just discussing in your program about the nuclear threat. And I'm just going to tell you that Russian airplanes, after the Russians have occupied territory where the Chernobyl nuclear power station is, they right now are flying over it and sitting there are shooting directly at Kyiv, and we cannot respond because we are worried that this way we will be shooting at nuclear power station. So you might underestimate the nuclear threat is much, much closer. Even from that fact that Putin has announced that he is going to put his nuclear deterrence on alert.
Is it your concern that there may be, in the midst of all of this, inadvertently, without anybody meaning for it to happen, a nuclear accident?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, as Putin and his army are targeting not only the critical infrastructure objects, but among them already several electric power stations, and somewhere there we do have atomic power stations across the country, so they might hit into one of those. Moreover, as I mentioned, Chernobyl is under their control at this particular moment, and we are not receiving, and MAGATE is not receiving any information on what the radiation situation is there in this particular moment.
We were, as you heard, discussing at the end of the last part, the question of the European action, European support. Do you think you could have had more help faster from the EU, from Britain and from the United States?
Absolutely. I think if we wouldn't have postponed the actions that we were asking for 8 years since the war of Russian Federation has started against Ukraine in the east of Ukraine and in the with the illegal, totally annexation of Crimea, if at that point the sanctions were not pitiful that the West has taken, and if you were more engaging in helping us to arm ourselves and to ensure that we have a bigger defense capacity to withhold possible developments, we would have been much better off.
Can I just ask you, you of course are in charge of this, or chairs the committee, which is about Ukraine's relationship with the EU. Would it have made a difference, do you think, if you had been in the EU? And where is the status of your application now?
You know, just today there was a common political move from actually all the political parties, besides one, which is Kremlin party in Ukraine, where our political leaders have taken the letter to the European Parliament asking to grant candidate status and fast lane for Ukrainian EU membership. And also President Zelensky has signed the letter to the European Union asking for membership. That's where we are. Obviously, there is no official response at this particular moment.
Ivana Klimpush-Tinsadze, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
And,
thank you for having me.
Stay safe. Shastia.
Thank you.
Let's go back to the wall and talk to Felix Hawes.
Since Brexit, the UK has undoubtedly lost the ability to be part of a large collective voice, resulting in delays to important announcements such as the helping of Ukrainian refugees. However, the UK is still the world's leading soft power, according to the Institute for Government. It's still a member of NATO, the G7, and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Its capital, London, is the financial capital of the world, beating New York and Paris. And the UK has been a leading voice against Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So my question to the panel, did Brexit reduce the UK's influence on the world stage?
Thank you, Felix. That's a very direct question. Panel, the question there from Felix is, has Brexit reduced the UK's influence on the world stage? Koja Koram.
Well, I think it's difficult to argue against the idea that Brexit, both as a legal process and as a national debate, contributed to this atmosphere of isolationism and protectionism that we see all across the world. In fairness to Brexit and to the interest of not reopening that whole conversation, I think it's important to recognise that it was part of a global trend towards increasing isolationism. We see that in Trump, we see that all across the globe. But I think we need to recognise that this disinvestment from ideas of multilateralism, from an international rules-based order, has eroded the ability to limit autocrats like Putin taken the actions that they've done over the past week. I think there's been a lot of conversation over the course of this panel about the importance of unity in Europe. We think about the EU and think about NATO, but I also think it's important to recognise that the foundational institution of an international rules-based order is the United Nations. And the United Nations is something that has been weakened And I think the UK has a role in being able to put that back together. Like Felix mentioned, it's still a member of the Security Council and needs to try and reinforce that institution. Richard
Sheriff, did Brexit make any difference?
Well, from my perspective as an ex-professional soldier and part of NATO, but also because of the role I played, I was also an EU operation commander as well. And that allowed UK to have a foot in both camps and to be able to bring the capabilities of NATO to bear to support the European Union. I'm afraid it did. Now, I'm very aware, of course, the majority voted for it, so we have to get on with it. But I fear that the sort of squabbling, divisions, isolationism that Koja touched on has impacted on us.
I want to talk to Judith Randall, who I know had rather strong views on the issue of Brexit. Where are you on this now, Judith?
I still have strong views. I also would like to say that my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. They're innocent victims whose country is under attack without provocation. And I've no words for Putin. But I do want to say that I personally voted to leave the EU. At the time, none of us knew what we were actually voting for. And the impact of leaving the EU has been much bigger than we thought. We voted, in effect, for a divided Europe, and Putin has taken full advantage.
Thank you, Judith. Well, Aisha, I think that's a view that you're going to be pretty sympathetic to. But let me just at least put what Prime Minister might say if he's here. We now have the freedom to act. And by the way, we were first into the ring on making the case for taking Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, and that's part of our independence.
I really push back against that, Trevor. Good try, and, you know, God loves a trier. But let's be honest, right? Part of the bigger narrative about this is upholding international law. Through Brexit, through this torturous situation with Northern Ireland, our own government has been pulled up by saying we will break international law in a limited and specific way. So Brexit has, of course, weakened us. We've all had a discussion about the power of unity, yet we have decided to go it alone. But, and I do want to give an objective, balanced view on this, I don't think it has meant that we haven't had a really important role to play in this conflict. I do think Boris Johnson has made the right noises. But there's one area where Boris Johnson could show to Remainers like me that Britain's place in the world will not be diminished, and that is by having a much more open-hearted, generous programme for refugees. We should be opening Britain up the same way that the EU has opened itself up. That is one way for Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, Liz Truss to send a signal to everyone in Britain and everybody across the world that Britain is a global player and that we are humane and compassionate.
Well, thank you for that, because actually that's exactly where we're going. As fighting continues in Ukraine, we'll ask what the crisis could mean for the UK and what more as a country we could do to help those affected.
These coaches are full of women and children and pensioners who are fleeing their country.
An additional 100,000 Ukrainians will be able to seek sanctuary in the UK.
We walked about 20 kilometers and we are exhausted.
I want to survive because I have a family in Europe.
The innocence of youth displaced by the horror of war.
The scenes of thousands of people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine have been some of the most powerful of recent days. And the UK government has come under significant pressure to commit to helping those displaced by the fighting. Julie Fay, you're in Tewkesbury.
We are dealing with the here and now. We're dealing with a socio-economic war. We're dealing with an arms war. We're also potentially dealing with a cyber war as well. But what the discussion's been leading up to is, what is Vladimir Putin's endgame? Will he be happy with the restoration of the USSR, or does he want more? Does he actually want an alliance with China, for example, to create a superpower, which will really, really change the balance of power in the world? So that's my question. How prepared are we as a country to deal with the consequences of whatever his endgame is?
Julie, thank you so much for that question. how prepared is Britain to deal with the consequences of the attack on Ukraine? Aisha Hazarika.
I don't think we are psychologically prepared as a country. I think we're a sort of week into this crisis. We're all getting our heads around it. We all have huge empathy and solidarity with what's happening in Ukraine. I think people are frightened here as well, particularly with the talk of nuclear weapons being used. But we have to think about the practical consequences. Number one, your contributor's right, a new world order. We have to think about that. Number two, what we do about refugees. I think we have to open ourselves up, but that will take money, it will take planning. It means the whole of the UK needs to play its part, working with councils. But the third thing we need to think about is that this conflict has collided with post-Brexit, post-pandemic, and of course an energy crisis and an existing cost of living crisis. There is going to be an economic hit to the citizens of this country as well. We could see energy bills going up to £3,000 a year. I think our politicians do need to prepare the citizens of this country for what is coming down the track.
Simon Fraser?
Well, I think Julie makes a very good point. I mean, we've grown too comfortable since the end of the Cold War. We've thought that this would carry on and that everything would be fine, and it's not. We now have war in Europe. We have a challenge to the whole international system, and what we need to do is realise that if we believe in our societies and the values of our societies, which I think we do, we've got to be prepared to stand up for them. And that's the lesson that I think we're drawing out of this conversation. We've got to be united, clear, and we've got to have will to not only react to what Putin does, but to decide what we want and impose it. And just picking up on the China point very briefly, if I may, I think there is a risk that the Chinese and the Russians may make common cause, but I wouldn't exaggerate it for the time being. I think the Chinese, if you look at their behaviour so far, they're being cautious, they're being relatively neutral, they abstained in the United Nations Security Council vote. They don't really want to get dragged into Putin's war. So let's not, if we are careful in our diplomacy and if we work carefully with China, whilst not underestimating the risk from them, it's not necessarily that they will join up with Russia.
All right. Let's talk to, actually, now quite an old friend of the programme, Patrice Wellesley-Cole. You have been an immigration judge, Patrice. What do you make of this point about migration?
Good evening, Trevor. Thank you. Yes, well, so far, over 500,000 have fled Ukraine, according to the UNHCR, fearing for their lives, whom we will have to welcome here in the UK. What is really important is that we talk about these people not as a wave of migrants, but as asylum seekers in fear of their lives. The UK needs to do the very best it can to support them. Last night, the Prime Minister said we're going to nearby countries like Poland and Hungary, and they've set up reception centres for them. So not all of them will come here. And many will come to England if they have family here. There's a family reunion policy. So I think we need to open our arms. It's a humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Patrice. Kojo.
I think that the importance of a generous and well-resourced, well-funded refugee policy that Jimmy and Aisha mentioned is really central. And it's something that we're seeing across Europe, and it's something that needs to be replicated here in the UK. But I do want to stress that I think that in contrast to these other European countries, there is something else that the UK can do to weaken Putin that they are not able to do. Because of the relationship between the wealth of Putin and the City of London, as well as Britain's overseas territories in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands, Britain has the ability to strike at the oligarch wealth that supports Putin. This is another ambitious, aggressive move that the government should be making, as well as supporting refugees.
OK, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. Just remains for me to thank our panellists, Simon Fraser, Aisha Hazarika, Richard Shirreff, Kojo Koram. Of course, it's you at home who are always at the centre of this conversation. If you'd like to be part of the programme next time, get in touch by emailing thegreatdebate@sky.uk. For now, I want to thank everybody who's been on the viewers' panel. Difficult subject, but you guys were as great as ever. Thank you so much. And of course, you at home, keep talking, and we'll see you again at the same time next week for The Great Debate.